This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Today we are going to talk about the 2006 film The Prestige, directed by Christopher Nolan. The movie is based on the 1995 book of the same name written by Christopher Priest. Priest also wrote the screenplay to the movie. Both the movie and the book portray the interconnected lives of two stage magicians during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We will discuss the themes and background and context of this really great book and movie. I'm really happy to be joined again by Annie of the 5'2" blog. Annie was a guest previously when we discussed Dorian Gray. Thanks, Annie, so much for coming on, and I appreciate you coming on again. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so, I've just finished university, so I'm a student at the moment still, and I'm going to do a master's in film and writing. I'm also an author of the blog 5'2blog.com, and I'm an English and drama teacher as well. I'm actually from Birmingham in England, and I just have a huge interest altogether in books and films and how they're adapted, so this is pretty much perfect for me.
Even before we get started, because I know a lot of this will come out, what brought you or what interests you in this book? Because I believe on your blog you said it was one of your favorite books.
Oh yeah, it is. It's definitely one of my favorite books. I love the way that the multi-narrative is put together. So we have not only a story about two people at the beginning, but then we get their whole sort of ancestry, and there's a massive story within the story. And I love the way it's structured. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, that seems really unique, the way the book is structured, that it's a frame reference through the journals of the two main characters being discussed and looked at through the perspective of their fourth generation grandchildren.
Yeah, the characters as well themselves are absolutely brilliant. I mean, the way we see so much sort of opposition between the two magicians, and then how it's been displayed through the two characters from sort of the modern day, and how they've got two completely different lives as well. That's pretty awesome.
And then speaking of the characters in the cast, it had a great cast and characters. Just a quick note here that we might be switching a little bit because the novel and the film use slightly different names, and both of the main characters use stage names. Hugh Jackman plays Rupert or Robert Angier. He's also known as the Great Danton, but he's also a peer in the English aristocracy, so he's also known as Lord Codlow or the Earl of Calderdale, so he has like 5 names. The pronunciation the movie uses is Angier, but the book, I kind of got the feeling that they said it in a more English way, Angier. Which one do you prefer to use?
I mean, I actually watched the film before I read the book, so I was kind of reading it as Angier almost, but I think it does look pretty sort of more European than how I'm pronouncing it, so I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, man, we'll just go with either one. Then we have Christian Bale, who plays Alfred Borden, and he's also known as Le Professeur de la Magie, or the professor in the movie. Then the movie has a character that's not quite in the book, known as Cutter, and he's Angier's ingénieur, or the person who designs and builds his magical apparatus or his illusions. And then David Bowie has a small but really important role as Nikola Tesla. Then Scarlett Johansson plays Olive or Olivia Wenscombe, who's a stage assistant and the love interest of both Borden and Angier. We'll get into the characters a bit more later, but it's worth discussing now that we don't even know who all of the characters are until later in the book and the film. Annie, how do you think the book and the film use just even right off the bat, how they use sleight of hand to disguise the characters?
I think it's quite important to notice how the two characters sort of fit together, especially in the film, because they fit together slightly differently in the film. They start off being, not really being friends, but being sort of contented with each other. And from this, we get this feeling that Borden is actually the better magician. So Borden is the one that actually uses the sort of magical techniques of sleight of hand, and that is why Cutter is sort of Angier's sort of builder, if you will, because Angier sees himself as the less capable magician and needs a builder or needs a person to guide him, whereas Borden just uses the sleight of hand techniques. And I think it's quite important to also realise that the film, well, I didn't feel the book did it that much, but the film really does tend to change the whole sort of hero and villain notion. So in the film, Borden is definitely the good guy and Angier is definitely the bad guy, whereas in the book you just can't tell. So
maybe you can set us up just a little bit of where the book and the movie take place and what's sort of the context of the environment that it takes place in.
Okay, so the entire film is set in the late 1800s, and in this massive Victorian setting, we see two things. We see Borden's background, which is moderate, sort of edging on poverty, and then we see the background of Angier, which is the exact opposite. So Angier is this sort of upper middle class guy, and Borden is sort of the normal working class person. So the film only really covers a small section of the book, and it concentrates on the narrative around the trick, the transported man. So the book covers this sort of wider context of narrative and runs well into the 20th century. But with the running time for the film, we can kind of see that Nolan needed to cut that down a little bit and concentrate on what was actually very, very important. The reception of the book was actually pretty good at the time it was released, so it won many, many awards in the 90s. The James Tate Award, the World Fantasy Award, and the Bram Stoker Award. So it made a very, very successful book. And even in newspapers it stated that the book was intelligent and it was mostly about illusion and secrecy. So in terms of how the movie was made, because it was only concentrating on two sections of the book, people who had already read the book felt a little bit disillusioned from this. So when interviewed about the writing process of the book, Priest stated it was a lot like the feud between a Chinese magician and his imitator, and that was one of the things that inspired the Angier-Borden rivalry. So in fact, one thing that Priest stated that he enjoyed about the film was the seriousness of the rivalry and the attention paid to this multi-narrative complex. So we get Borden's story from Borden's point of view, and we get Angier's story from Angier's point of view, and then they sort of fuse together. So saying that, in terms of the question of time period, Priest stated that he was impressed by this neo-Victorian essence, but was less impressed, not really disappointed, but not really impressed very much by the omission of the modern context, so the characters from our modern times from the 1900s, and he said that it made the story for him a little bit disjointed, which I kind of agree with. So that's the context there.
Yeah, I think that approaching the movie, I think it was better to watch the movie first and then read the book, because the book kind of filled out the movie, whereas I think if you approached it the other way, you'd feel like kind of let down at what the movie portrayed from the book.
Definitely. I mean, a lot of people I know who read the book first didn't actually like the movie very much because of the sheer amount it missed out.
The first scene in which Cutter explains the plot and then he foreshadows some later events. What is the structure of the movie, and how does the movie, the structure of the movie actually models a illusion? Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how they do that and how they pull that off.
Okay, so the very first scene of Borden's narrative, so where the film timeline starts and the very first scene of the films are in fact completely different, and even though they deal with the same narrative period, so the book and the film, when we get to Borden's narrative, they sort of start in the same place, but in a different situation. So the book deals with an exposition of character. So Borden is introduced and we have an immediate feeling of secrecy. But this secrecy is introduced quite a bit later in the film, and when Borden keeps repeating that there are secrets in his life. In the book, one of the very first lines is, "The story of my life is the story of secrets by which I have lived my life." So Borden's narrative is a very character-driven story in the book. So we're introduced to how he grew up, where he lived, sort of becoming the magician that we know him as. So this is omitted from the first part of the film. I believe it's to save time. But it's also explored as something being against Angier, as if Angier is the villain because he is of better wealth, because especially in British films, the rich man's always the villain. The very first image in the film is actually top hats. And contrary to popular belief, I believe this is a very good way of portraying one of Borden's very first lines. So he says, "My name, my real name, is Alfred Borden." The scattering of top hats, obviously this foreshadows Angier's trick, but it also foreshadows what the prestige is and this theme of multiplicity. So we have the whole story explained in one still image of loads of top hats scattered all over the floor. But it also foreshadows Borden's trick, because Christian Bale has this voiceover where he says, "Are you watching closely?" which gives us sort of the knowledge of, is it Borden's character that has this multiplicity before we even meet him?
Cutter, in the very beginning, he also lays out what the different steps are of a magical illusion. What are those steps, and how do they use that in the film narrative? And they also use it in the book narrative as well.
Okay, so when Cutter begins explaining what will actually become the plot of the film, there's three main sections. So there's the pledge, there's the turn, and there's the prestige. So we have to assume, because a lot of us know Christopher Nolan's movies, we have to assume that this will be of hyper importance later on. Okay? And we see this running symbol as well of canaries. Canaries in the film represent the dead or the lost, or in this case, the shells. We have the symbol also of cages, representing the secrecy of the prestige, and the tension of the film is that the trick depends on whether the canary lives or dies. So the first scene of the film is so packed full of symbolism that it would require serious dissecting. But in comparison to the book, it is much more context-driven and needs to establish various themes that will be important later on, rather than establishing various characters. So in contrast to the book, the film wants to establish every single main theme in that scene where Cutter is sort of performing the trick and explaining that there are the three parts, the pledge, the turn, and the prestige. In the book, in chapter 2 and chapter 16, it's Borden that explains this, not Cutter. And I've been researching, I have absolutely no idea why that is. I believe that Nolan did this to try and engage the audience with what they were watching. Instead of having Borden introduced initially, we hear him before we see him. So obviously this adds to the whole mystery of the prestige and to the storyline, as the audience are asked if they're watching the screen closely, which means anything directly after this should be of high importance to the storyline. Angier is introduced as the first character, and we see him before we hear him. So this is definitely the opposition to Borden. So Borden's the one we hear first, Angier's the one we see first. Angier performs a trick whilst Cutter performs a trick with Borden's daughter with a canary. And this sort of tandem is actually, I think it's repeated later on in the film. So this kind of shows that the canary and Angier are linked together. Cutter is obviously the designer for Angier's material, and Cutter is also performing this trick with a cage and a canary, which looks disturbingly similar to the water case thing that Angier uses. But Angier's narrative in the book starts off completely differently. It actually begins when he's 9 years old. So I actually believe that the book and the film are trying to show different things in these initial scenes. So again, whilst the book is character and exposition driven, the theme is thematic and context driven. And they establish the characters quite differently, and this is of prime importance as it literally changes the course of the film in comparison to its source material. So Angier is first established as a victim. We see him drowning, and that Borden doesn't do anything to help, and that Angier drowns and dies. Whereas in the book, Borden's narrative begins with the idea that Borden is the victim of hardship, through the way in which he describes his lower class lifestyle and how he grows up. So I believe this changes the way in which the story is told in the film, as both men in the book and the film switch from good and bad. This is actually much clearer in the film. In the film, you can actually tell that Angier is supposed to be the bad guy, but in the book, it's more difficult to tell since Borden is the sort of victim of hardship. We haven't actually heard Angier's narrative. But then again, when we change that around, the first thing we see is Borden refusing to help Angier out of a water tank in which he's drowning. Without knowing any context, we immediately assume that Borden is the bad guy and Angier is the good guy, whereas in fact it's not like that at all. So in many ways, both the book and the film play with this hero and villain complex, but I think the film establishes it better, but after that they can't really manipulate it. So after it's set in our minds that because Angier is the rich guy, he must be the villain, they have trouble sort of manipulating that. Even when Angier's wife dies, we cannot manipulate that image of Angier. But in the book, because of these broken narratives, we are able to switch between the two. So when Borden's growing up in hardship to the rivalry, Borden could possibly be the villain. And we can sort of manipulate this in Angier's narrative for Angier being the villain. So it's never perfectly fixed. But manipulation is much easier in the book than it is in the film. So the whole prestige of the film is established in the very first scene, and it's the conflict that's established. The fact that Borden was looking to, I use the term loosely, sabotage Angier's trick, according to the first scene. So it shows that Borden is the bad guy, whereas the very same scene in the last part of the film, after the plot has happened, Borden's the good guy and Angier's the villain. I think that this conflict being established in the first scene was a good idea, but it did sort of mess with how you put the chronology of the film together. Does that scene actually come first or last? Because Borden gets arrested in the middle of the film. So I think upon first watch, it would be difficult to figure out.
Yeah, I think the book laid it out a lot better by having Borden as the first person to tell his story, and you know that there's something else going on with him, that, you know, his life is an illusion. And then you get to view that through Angier's perspective, and you can still sort of feel that Borden isn't completely a bad guy. I think the book played that you don't know who's the protagonist, who's the antagonist, a lot better. That maybe it was something about how that would be very difficult to do in film.
Yeah, especially with the whole chronology of that very first scene coming at both the beginning and the end, trying to change our perceptions of things by sort of putting a little section at the end where Borden shoots Angier and everything sort of goes. I should have said a spoiler alert or something. But the main focus being that Angier is actually the villain of the story, which was in our minds anyway, because obviously embedded for many years, the one who is rich is always the villain.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. What did you make of that scene? It was when Julia, Angier's wife, it was like her funeral, and Angier asks Borden, which knot did you use? Did you use the Langford double or the whatever? I don't even remember what the other one was called. But Borden says, I don't know. I think he said he wasn't sure if he used one. He's 50-50. Do you think they were trying to give it away there that he was split?
I think that seems actually done quite cleverly. I don't think that the man who turned up to the funeral was actually the same man that turned up to the trick. So I think they did drop it quite cleverly, but it would take many watchers to actually realise that that's what's happened. I think what did actually go on was the fact that the two were split and one tied the knot and one didn't, and the other one went to the funeral. It's a concept, these small things are easier to recognise upon sort of a second, maybe third, even a fourth watch, but upon a first watch it wouldn't necessarily click. It would just click as a rivalry. This man has killed that man's wife by tying the wrong knot, and now he can't recall it in fear that it will spark a conflict, whereas in reality it's not actually the same person. So
there was one other scene too where I think that this probably was like my fifth or sixth watch of it, where they were having Borden and Fallon were having dinner with Olivia Wenscombe and Borden's wife. And I thought Borden was really drunk, and it was after he had had a bad interaction with Angier, and he was just such a jerk. And Fallon kind of whisks away. I think that was another one where they were kind of sneaking it in there, that there was more of an allusion to Borden's life than what we are shown up front.
I mean, definitely. I think this sort of, especially that part, is quite a good homage to the book, because he does say that his life is lived by secrets, and that is the one thing in the film that keeps getting repeated, that Borden says that his life is full of secrets, but obviously we don't, because he's a magician, we don't see this as something that would infiltrate into his sort of more personal, more intimate life. But in fact it does, and upon sort of a good couple of watches, you'd notice there are quite a few instances where Borden and Fallon are sort of completely juxtaposed to each other in terms of behaviour. So when Borden's doing something wrong, Fallon isn't there. And Fallon turns up when Borden wants to do right. It kind of makes it quite confusing to tell which one actually gets arrested.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the scenes with Fallon. And then one other scene struck me when Borden's wife told him that she was pregnant, and he's just over the moon about it. And he was like, why didn't you tell Fallon while he was here? Like, yeah, it'd be cool to tell your friend that you're pregnant. But he was like intimate that Fallon was just as important to knowing as he himself, Borden himself, was.
Yeah, I think they definitely tried to drop it quite clearly here, that everything that Borden knows, Fallon has to know as well, purely because of this act that he has to put on, that sort of, he has to be the other person in and out, so he has to know everything about Borden.
Now, we haven't talked as much about the actual stage magic that they've done. One of the interesting scenes is when Borden does his famous trick called the Transported Man. Tell us a little bit about their different approaches on magic and their themes. Angier's known as more of a showman, but he's technically not as good of a magician, whereas Borden is a better technical magician and illusionist, but his showmanship is lacking. What did that scene, what was it meant to show us?
So physically in that scene, we see Borden perform the very first version of the Transported Man trick. So he has a red ball, and there's two doors on stage, one at either side, and he bounces the ball. He goes through a door and reappears through another one on the other side of the stage, just in time to catch the ball. In chapter 16 of the book, Borden explains the Pledge 10 prestige parallel to his own trick. So he does this by using other names. So we have the setup, the performance, and effect. Okay, so in the film, and this is sort of presented at the beginning as being something of massive importance, because it's both a small part of the film, in terms of how the tricks are structured, but it's also the structure of the film itself. And seeing it performed sort of helps you to contextualize what's actually going on. And upon a couple of watches, seeing that scene and putting it into the context of the overall structure of the film would make the film hopefully easier to understand. So when Borden performs the trick, we see that there's hardly any set. Okay, he's a working class guy. He doesn't have a lot of money. He's got 2 doors and a red rubber ball. So thus we have to apply what Cutter had stated in the first scene to this scene in the film, as it's a magic trick. So, but Borden not only refers to this in a side-by-side comparison of the Pledge, the Turn, the Prestige, he also offers 6 categories for magic tricks, which are explored as different symbols in the film. So in this scene, Borden has 4 of these 6, I think. Yeah, 4 of these 6 sort of different sectors of magic being performed at once, whereas he actually argues that most magicians only use 2 or 3. He's using 4. So the 6 categories, he says, are production, disappearance, transformation, transposition, defiance of the natural lords, and secret motive power. So production is to make something appear out of nothing. So it applies to Borden in the film and the book, as he explains he has to make something out of himself. He's coming out of poverty, and this poverty is presented on stage. He doesn't have any showmanship. Okay? So this is seen as the transported man trick, as well as Borden makes himself appear out of nowhere after a brief disappearance. Okay, it's very, very clever how Nolan's put this together. And the second one, disappearance, or to make something disappear into nothing, applies to Angier, as he makes himself disappear from the worldwide stage by staging his death and blaming Borden. Only after the story unravels do the audience realise the prestige behind the character of Lord Cardlow. And this is also seen in that very first trick, as Borden's brief disappearance is seemingly like the prestige or the unknown factor of the trick, which is also true for the disappearance of Angier. Okay, it's not real, it doesn't actually exist, but it's staged to make it look like it has. Transformation, or the apparent changing of one thing into another, is also applicable to Borden and Angier, as both of them create new identities. So, respectively, the Professor and the Great Danton. They manage to change themselves into something else. And so also this representation of duplicity and multiplicity helps understand this, as both characters have secrets located in both of these ideas. So Angier uses shells and Borden uses a twin. So in The Transported Man, this very, very first, very stripped, original edition of the first trick, the audience do not know that Borden has a twin. He has, to them, changed himself from one thing into another. Okay, so therefore this is part of the prestige of this trick, that the audience of this trick, sort of sitting in the audience, and the audience in the cinema at the time, upon first watch, wouldn't even guess that Borden had a twin, because they look so similar. And again, it's that, I think he has an injury on his hand that he repeats with Fallon. The next one is transposition. So the apparent changing of place of 2 or more objects. So he presents this as Borden and his twin moving from being small-time magicians to becoming big-scale stars. So we go from just being Alfred Borden to being the Professor, and the change in place as well. We go from that very small stripped stage to the massive sort of theatre stages of London. And so as characters, they both embody this transported man trick, going from nothing to something. And so in The Transported Man, it's physically supported by the change of place. So we've got one side of the stage to the other, both of them representing sort of the class in society argument. Borden and the twins sort of take this secret and move it through society, so they're able to perform this trick in everyday life. And this is sort of that apparent changing of place of two or more objects. So as they move through society, the trick does not change. So the trick remains as it is, stripped stage, just the two doors and the bouncy red ball. All Borden does is dress it up a little bit because he's obviously moving up in the world. It's Angier that comes and changes it completely. So the defiance of natural laws is presented by Borden's ability over Angier's. So it's clear by book and film that Borden's the better magician. He's able to foil Angier's tricks and find out what the root is and figure out the prestige. So Borden's ability, according to Angier, defeats natural laws, as Angier, believing he's the more skilled magician than Borden is, can't figure out what the prestige of the transported man is. So this is something that the audience also keep missing throughout the film in the third act. Makes it clear, but also confuses Angier's prestige for the rest of us, because it can't be that both of them have a twin. It seems a little bit too obvious. And it isn't. The fact that Borden's prestige is right in front of us, and we keep missing it until the final act, Borden explains himself, is the pinnacle of the conflict, as Angier now has to accept that he's not the more skilled magician. So it's presented in this sort of trick as Borden manages to defy the laws of time. Okay, he defies sort of moving across the stage. Nobody can move that fast. And also his sort of moving of class. But Borden's hints throughout the film that we keep missing sort of hint at that sort of time gap. It's literally like a split second that we see it and it's gone. So it's the defiance of time. And the last one is the secret motive power. So this one is sort of causing objects to appear or move on their own at their own will. So this is Borden himself. His movement through the film is shown most primarily through the fact that he is still alive after being hanged. So the secret part revolves around how we try to piece together, how we try to figure out how you can live a normal life after being hanged. It doesn't work for us. And this is the sort of mysterious rising from the pack that Borden does. He is a working class man. He acts completely out of his position. If we put this into this neo-Victorian context, that is enough to sort of ostracize someone, sort of acting out of your position. And the way that Borden acts, the way that Borden behaves, makes us believe that there's either something more going on or there's somebody sort of chasing after him. Okay, he's trying to represent himself as a different person. He is moving at his own will without any care for anybody around him, even down to his wife. His wife's sort of death in the film, he doesn't seem very affected by that, but we could also argue that we're not actually seeing Borden, we're seeing Fallon. We don't know who we're seeing. And this is the sort of moving at their own will. They don't tell the audience which one is which at any particular time. We don't have any labels, we don't have any signs, we just have to guess. And it's only in chapter 18 of the book that we get the original transported man. So he states that it's foremost an illusion. Okay, so this is made clear by the very first scene of the film, and the application of the different categories of Cutter's maxim to this scene. So the trick itself sets up the entire film. The trick is Borden, and that's why it doesn't work for Angier. That's why Angier has to change it.
One thing that I'm interested in and that you were bringing up is the love interests of both Borden and Angier. Especially Angier, his love interest and his relationship with his wife is almost completely the opposite in the book and the movie, but they kind of get to the same point. What do you think? What were we trying to learn through Angier's love interest with his wife in the movie and in the book?
So The way in which it's portrayed in the book is obviously completely different because of the fact that his wife is a part of the storyline. In the film, the death of his wife is the sort of rivalry, the rage, part of the conflict that fuels his hatred towards Borden. But when we do actually look at the book and we do actually see the relationship between Angier and his wife, we see that it's not as unsteady as sort of Borden's lifestyle. Angier seems to have quite a grounded lifestyle with his wife in the book. She's more or less part of his magic stuff, and they perform seances together, which Borden obviously sabotages in the book. But in the film, she doesn't really get that much of a character. She dies, but we get these flashbacks to her, which suggest, almost infer, that Angier's hatred is fueled by the death of his wife, almost trying to justify why he's the villain of the film. It's a very odd relationship, I think, and I think in the book it's portrayed slightly better. I would have liked Julia to be a bit more of a character in the film. It seemed a little bit of a easy get-out clause to blame Angier's rage on the death of his wife.
One thing that was a kind of a major part of the movie, but more of a gimmick, and I think it was fleshed out a little bit more in the book, was that, as you said, that Angiers was not as good of a magician, and he could not comprehend that Borden's illusion wasn't an illusion. He thought that somehow that Borden had invented a machine, especially because Borden had told him about Tesla. But again, that was an illusion that Borden was using to throw Angier off the trail of how he really did his trick. What was the purpose of involving Tesla and that sort of steampunk Victorian era technology?
When we look at the film, we see Angier reading Borden's diary, and obviously there's that whole thing about the word Tesla that means that Angier can break the code and read Borden's notes. But when we actually get to Nikola Tesla making the machine for Angier, we see that the machine's been tested out on top hats and cats so many times, and Angier is adamant that this is the trick. This is the way that Borden does his trick. But then we have to think, at this specific moment in time, at this absolute specific moment in time, Borden isn't actually very well known in London. He is still climbing up the rails, and Angier saying that Borden has bought this machine for himself is almost impossible. He wouldn't have the money to get this machine built. Because he's still climbing, he is a working class guy, and Angier can't understand this. Angier cannot understand that the trick is so incredibly simple. So when we get to sort of Tesla making the machine, it's always mentioned that he made the machine for one other person. And that's very important because he says he made the machine for only one other person. So it means it couldn't have been Borden because there's two of them. I find this incredibly clever, and I only realised it a couple of weeks ago, actually, that Borden and Fallon never seem to go anywhere without each other, being in the perimeter. So if they went to Nikola Tesla, they would have went together. And then Tesla saying that he made the machine for one other person means that it couldn't have been Borden that he made it for. But Angier is still adamant that that one other person is Borden. And I think adding Tesla into the mix sort of states that Angier has this wealth and needs to get this trick, so he detaches the trick from the man in hopes of performing the trick to a higher standard, which is kind of like a allegory for Victorian society, that the rich always take from the poor and make things better for themselves. But with this trick, because it's so big, Angier doesn't realise that he's being puppeteered throughout the whole thing by Borden. I think it's very intelligent, and we only find it when Borden says at the end in the diary that he knows that Angier's reading it.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Let's talk a little bit about Borden's imprisonment. That didn't happen in the book at all, but what was the purpose of those imprisonment scenes? And they to me, that even though they weren't in the book, they sort of encapsulated what the book was trying to go for.
Yeah, so Borden isn't, he's not imprisoned in the book, but he is imprisoned in the film, so he realises that Lord Cardlow is actually Angier while he's imprisoned. So it means that Angier is still alive, and if Angier's alive, Borden's innocent. And Borden, there's this scene where they're at the gates, and Borden asks for his life, and Angier declines, knowing this to suffice as revenge. So he walks away from Borden, letting Borden go to hang, but Borden doesn't know how Angier managed to live. So now we've got this change in the trick. Angier thinks that he's worked out how Borden does the trick, but now that Angier's still alive, Borden can't work out how Angier's doing it, and having a twin seems a little bit too simplistic for Borden, even though he himself has one. Because Angier's of the upper class, it seems almost impossible. So, unfortunately, it doesn't happen like this in the book. It's instead represented by chapters 37 to 39. The symbols and motives remain the same in design and method. So Borden explains in chapter 37 that Angier suffered injuries whilst performing an illusion, and thus 7 weeks after a scuffle with Borden, Angier died. Borden thought it odd that Angier's obituary wasn't published until after the funeral. So this shows that if read properly, someone was trying to keep Angier's death a secret, just like pretty much everything else in the book. In the film, the presentation of Lord Cardlow confirms that Angier's late obituary was due to Lord Cardlow's delayed entry into the film. So Angier dies just before Lord Cardlow can make a character for himself, and thus they're the same person. This can be understood by reading Borden and Angier's narratives side by side and looking for discrepancies. So you really have to delve deep into the narrative and look at the changing themes and changing language use and how these themes develop. So Angier would purposefully make his language less frequented by magic when he is Lord Cardlow, as he does when he is Angier. So the other thing that's introduced here by the book is the shell or the prestige from Angier's trick. In the film, this is to serve as the main prestige of the entire thing, and it holds the secret together of Borden and Angier's conflict. So different between the film and the book is that Angier's wife is still alive by the time that Angier dies, and the conflict that's conveyed in the book is by Julia's miscarriage rather than her death. So the fact that the conflict is seen to be resolved and Angier believes he's won is actually turn. So it's that sort of second section of the trick where these extraordinary things begin to happen to Angier. He thinks that he's finally done it. He is now the greatest magician in London. So the entire film, as opposed to the book, is actually based on Borden's design, not Angier's. I actually think the book is based on Angier's design, or for most of the book he thinks it is, and by the end, oh god, I don't even want to talk about the ending of the book at the moment. Every step that Angier takes, Borden already knows about, and thus Borden hides things from the reader as well, to make himself look like the underdog or the victim. So Borden is actually the manipulator. If we were to look at this on a grand scale, Borden is horrible. He's a horrible guy. He has manipulated this sort of wealthy, up-and-coming magician all the way through his life. He's treated him like a puppet without him knowing it. It's very clever, but it's also an incredibly horrible thing to do. So at the point in the film in which Borden's imprisoned and Angier as Lord Cardlow appears to him, we don't know that Borden has a twin. Some people may have guessed, but we don't fully know. We know now that Angier isn't dead, but we do not know how he isn't dead because we saw Borden not kill him, but Borden not help him when he died. Borden's killing of either himself or Fallon is directed at Borden's overall trick of the film, to make sure that he can live without secrets. He is adamant. He says it to his wife earlier on, and we just about miss it, that he wants to live without secrets. And I don't know whether this is true or not, but I think that Borden actually wants Fallon to die. That the whole purpose of manipulating Angier is to kill Fallon, not the other way around. I have this big theory. It's like a conspiracy theory. So in the book, Borden doesn't go to prison for the death of Angier, but instead is depressed by his death and tries to make himself look like the good guy, even though this conflict has just gone on forever. So he still laments the loss of the magician. If we stop at chapter 39 for a second, move back to chapter 38, we can see this chapter that doesn't make sense at all. And this is, I believe, that chapter that in the film is translated as Borden's imprisonment, because it doesn't make sense. If we take a closer look and see it from the point of view as Borden's diary as opposed to Angier's, it is written in past tense, and Angier's is written in present tense. So Borden must have written all of his entries along after they happened, and thus he's able to manipulate this narrative to his own advantage. There's gestures made in chapter 8 to the pledge and the turn. So it shows that Borden's hands are empty. He says his hands are empty and he's telling us the truth. And then he's making something appear, and these are faded paper flowers from the hands we sort of know to be empty. So these are all quotations that he actually says, and they make no sense. And this is embodying Borden's imprisonment. He wants to let go of these secrets. He wants to show you that he's telling the truth. So this shows that Borden, as in the scene of imprisonment, is playing with the death of Angier to his own advantage. So therefore, if we look at them side by side, we can assume that Borden actually wanted to be found out and be imprisoned. So this is my whole theory of the whole film being about killing Fallon instead of killing Angier. And so he knows that the murder would have made headlines. He knows that he's going to be out of business. He knows that he can let go of magic. And I see this as the conflict being from the very start of the film that Borden is trying to get out while Angier is trying to get in, and magic is the sort of the magic world is the main location for all of this. So Borden is constantly trying to drag himself out of it, whereas Angier is trying to push himself into it. So in the film, within the scene in which Borden discovers that Cardlo and Angier are the same person, he sees Cardlo as no difference in appearance to what Angier would look like if he was slightly older. But it's also clear that Borden already knows the secret since the death of his wife, and the prompting of loss caused him to give up his secrets, and therefore he doesn't spend a long time pleading with Cardlo in comparison to the amount of time Angier spends pleading with Borden at the end of the film. So instead, Borden's words when he goes to hang are clichéingly abracadabra. So it insinuates that it's part of his plan, okay, and that his plan is finished when he's hanged. Okay? And this is why Borden starts to fade out of the narrative after he's hanged, because he's out of the magic world. He's released his secrets now. Fallon's dead. He can live his life. So in the book, this scene happens slightly differently. Angier comes to Borden and tries to attack him with a knife in chapter 39. So he lunges at him, but Borden has managed to escape and return home without injury. And this is after Angier has died. So he claims that he saw a ghost and was absolutely horrified. It's also clear by this part that Angier may know the trick that Borden has created and has done. So Angier asks Borden, "Which one are you?" So this insinuates the different identities of Borden and Fallon, which is also incredibly clever. So when we go back to the main differentiation between Angier and Borden's narratives, it is that Angier's is written in the present and Borden's is written in the past. So when we deconstruct these sort of small quirks of chapter 38, which embodies that imprisonment, Borden has designed the narrative in order to suit his own story. Okay, so writing it all in past tense means that he's really thought about this. Okay, he's really sort of manipulated this narrative, and we have to question how much of this is actually true. So the image that is in the book that is not in the film is the faded paper flowers. So they're representative of this funeral lamentation period that he describes as being Angier's death. The fact that they are faded means that they are feigned or faked. And the paper flowers infers the thin grief that Borden actually feels for the death of Angier. So he's trying to make us believe that he feels sort of lamentation and sadness and grief, but actually it's quite paper thin, like paper flowers, and thus he infers to the reader that he doesn't care about Angier. And this is presented through what is like 3 seconds of pleading for his life that he does while he's in prison, while the two men are standing either side of the gates. And it's transferred to the film by depicting Borden's hanging, and through, this might seem a little bit far-fetched, but through his facial expression when he's going to be hanged, he seems completely contented. He seems absolutely fine with the fact that he's going to be hanged, as if, whether it's Borden or Fallon, I'm going to go with the fact that it's Fallon, but whether Fallon knows that he is just a sort of chess piece in Borden's little game. So the whole film is just about killing him. And for some reason, I feel like he knows that through his facial expression. So keeping in mind that Borden's narrative is designed rather than written, it's also important to remember the end of chapter 39 also ends with a narrative difference. So the film depicts the last scene of chapter 39 to be Borden's acceptance of certain death, and that he'll also hang even though he's innocent. He's contented with this. But the book depicts it as the prestige of a trick. So this, if we put them side by side, it's clear to see that Borden's entire narrative and design is a trick. So there are small theories that believe that the entirety of chapter 39 never happened, but instead explaining the prestige of Angier's trick, which we see again at the end of the film. So this could be true if it weren't for the way in which Angier explains it. So if we didn't have Angier's narrative, we'd have to go by Borden's. So it's not explained as a trick, but rather just like a sci-fi fantasy. So Angier states that the prestige will rise again, and therefore chapter 39 is when Borden witnesses this rising. So it's different from the film that this scene is the closing for Borden's narrative. This, in the film, is the imprisonment scene, since neither Borden nor Angier's careers have never actually really closed. So one's in prison, and the other seems to have changed his identity, but both were alive in some way after they died. So the film's depiction of the third act is used to close the story, whereas in the book, chapter 39 is used to open the story to our sort of more modern times. So there are sections that are somewhat similar, but most of them are used more as symbols rather than part of a timeline.
Didn't really part of Borden had to die. In the movie, it's to try and get rid of the Fallon character, but in the book, it's one of Borden's, one of the twins, dies of a heart attack. Didn't Borden, his life was entirely magic. Didn't he really have to, one of them had to die so that Borden could really live?
Yeah, this is where my theory comes in, that the whole film is actually about killing Fallon and not killing Angier. That there's this sort of massive, full-scale juxtaposition between Borden and Angier, where Borden's trying to actually get out of magic, whereas Angier is trying to get in. And the only way that Borden can actually get out is by manipulating Angier into it and then absolutely destroying his career and sending Fallon to hang.
Now that we're into the final scenes of the movie, let's talk about how Angier dies in the movie.
This scene's quite odd because it would only make sense with the narrative that it's been put into, because it doesn't really happen in the book. So in the book, it is quite clear that Part 5, entitled The Prestiges, is about Angier and that he may still be alive. In the film, spoiler alert, he's dead. That's it. Angier gets shot by Borden. It states in the book, he showed no curiosity about us or fear of us, even though he knew we were there, watching him. So the line directly before this describes the appearance of the prestige of what is described to be Angier. So this is fairly odd because it doesn't take place in the film. And this is why I say to people, watch the film before you read the book, because if anything, the book is a lot more confusing than the film is. This is just completely omitted. I think Nolan omitted this because he felt that omitting Kate and Nikki's narratives completely would make the film a little bit problematic the way it was if we were just to take Borden and Angier's narratives, because they both seemingly go on alone until the end, at the end of both of their narratives. So Nolan completely omits the modern narratives, concentrates on the neo-Victorian, but in this penultimate scene in which Angier dies, this is, to us, a brand new scene. It's created by Nolan. It's not in the book at all. And so we see various motivations in the book where Angier would relate his sort of trick to continuing his own sort of mortality and sort of playing with science. Whereas in the film, the machine seems to be primarily for just beating Borden. So the film is so concentrated on the conflict that when we see Angier die in the penultimate scene, that's it, conflict over, Borden's won. But in the book, the question of mortality is quite a bit bigger. I mean, the question of mortality is that Angier can now use this machine to manipulate his own mortality and sort of elongate it to the point that his mortality crosses over into the next century. So I believe that Nolan made the right choice in omitting Kate and Nikki's narratives. So Nolan makes very naturally thought-provoking films, and I think that this very scene takes the Angier and Borden conflict and gives it a recognisable, sort of very satisfying ending. Even though it was sort of very dressed up, and some people argue that it was also a bit lazy. This is because there's supposed to be a big reveal at the end of the film, which is meant to give the whole film meaning. But a lot of people felt that it was left a little bit too open, so I don't know what happens to Borden afterwards. Who cares what happens to Borden? He's won the conflict. That was the whole point of the film. I mean, nobody cares what happens to Borden afterwards. His whole game was to get out of living his life by secrets, and he's done that. Fallon's gone to hang, Angier's been shot and died. The whole thing's over. Borden can live his life the way he wants now. But to my surprise, Christopher Priest felt the exact same way. So he thought the ending was a weak attempt at a twist ending. So I like to think this is true. When I say that I like to think this is true, I wanted to think this is true. I believe that the ending to the film satisfies the audience, but then again, if you were to read the book and take the book for its word, and the book is sort of the original script, the original source material, it is a weak ending. It sort of took out the mystery. There's no real symbols except for obviously water and fire, so we have the most obvious of symbols there. So I think Priest probably believed that it was the weakest scene in the movie, and I can actually see why that is. That scene seemed very much catered to explaining something to the audience, that yes, Borden wins at the end. So that was the main thing it was trying to explain, but it failed to do anything else. It just explains, this is the conflict, Borden wins, he shoots Angier, and having this positioning as well of Borden sort of kneeling over Angier as he's on the floor, this representing that Borden has already won before he shot Angier. It's very symbolistic, but it did seem a little bit out of place in the whole film, because the whole film is so clever, and then you've got the ending sort of just as disappointing as the ending of Fight Club. But because of Nolan's attention paid to the concept of the ending and sort of drawing this conflict to a close, the original experience that we get from the ending of the book is completely omitted from the film. I think that when the film was trying to be artistic throughout, it confused the audience so much that we had to have such a simple ending where one of them just shoots the other one. I mean, if that couldn't have been done earlier on, it kind of makes me laugh a little bit that the whole film is so incredibly intelligent. One just shoots the other one.
Yeah, I felt like the movie ended where everything was wrapped in a nice, neat package, and then that was that, where the end of the book, it ended the Nicky Borden / Andrew Wesley line pretty nicely, but then it basically did leave the rest of the novel. You're hanging there, and I felt like it didn't close the loop on some of the things that had been foreshadowed earlier.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but I think the book and the movie are trying to do different things, though. I think the whole point of the book is to kind of leave it open and say, well, I don't think we're supposed to go any further into it. But I think with the film, obviously, because it does need to make money, it does need to satisfy the audience, it does need a good review, so it does need to close off with something that's going to satisfy the audience. But I think one shooting the other one was a bit, I don't know, a tad bit lazy.
Let's, to wrap up the conversation, let's talk about the genre of the book and the genre of the movie. It kind of, you don't know where the movie sort of falls out. Is it science fiction with this device, or is it supposed to be a neo-Victorian? What do you think, each of those, what was the point and what was the genre of those films and the book?
And this is actually very interesting to me because a few years ago I wrote an entire essay on the genre of The Prestige and how it was in discrepancy. So the genre of the book it's clearly this cross between sci-fi and fantasy, magic realism and horror. So in 1996 it receives the World Fantasy Award. In 1995 it receives the James Tait Black Memorial Prize. So therefore it's clearly a work of literary fiction and blended fiction as it wins the WFA. So it's mostly based in magic realism and somewhat based in horror. So it tries its hand at horror. I don't think the horror really works as much in the book as it does in the film. But Christopher Priest himself, he does not like the term sci-fi that's given to his work. The Prestige and Separation and Inverted World all have been given the word sci-fi, and he doesn't like it. He thought that his dystopian worlds created through the satire of magic realism was probably not so fictional as a lot of readers may believe it to be. So in an interview with Charles Platt, Priest states his agenda when it comes to the word sci-fi, calling them the people who wrote the real stuff. So I feel now that nobody is writing real science fiction, and that all we have is a caricature of what it might have been. So his thorough disbelief in the term sci-fi has caused the branding of the film to be a mystery thriller, as opposed to what it would have been if it were a magic realism, which is sci-fi and fantasy. So Priest sort of tried his utmost to detach the word sci-fi from his book and from his film. So we get a mystery thriller now. That's the I think that's the official genre given to the film. The reason why the film may be thought of as a sci-fi and fantasy, I checked this out. A couple of years ago, I purchased The Prestige in a DVD copy, and it was in the sci-fi section of a now shut down Blockbuster. But I also purchased The Prestige on my laptop to watch it while writing this podcast, and I purchased it under mystery and thriller, which is very strange because they have different genres. But the machine usage, the way in which characters seem to think that they're excluded from harm, and that everyone's an individual being, this is all sci-fi and fantasy. This is very Orwellian, this is very sort of Aldous Huxley, this is all very one person rising above this sort of machine-laden world, or this world that is sort of against them in terms of authority, in terms of class. Obviously, Borden is one of those sort of dystopian protagonists, which is why people would think that this is a sci-fi film. And obviously, there's complete fantastical elements of magic. the book's mutual relation is based on this multi-narrative complex that's taking place. In sci-fi and fantasy books, we see all the time that we have multi-narratives. That is just standard of sci-fi. We see people's stories from many points of view. We see hero and villain storylines. Sci-fi and fantasy give us this multi-narrative complex again and again. And this is why I think that people have often mistaken the book and the film for a sci-fi and fantasy. So according to, there's an author that I used to read an article on called Analytic Metaphysics of Personal Identity and Wittgensteinian Film and Literature. So it actually has a bit about the Prestige in there, and I read it a few years ago. So it says that the film contains much more of an identity for each of the Prestige Angiers than the book does, and therefore is not only more complex in identity, but it's also more fantastical, as each of the Angiers seems to believe that they are the real one. So Reed makes a better overall meaning of the film relating back to the book. He states that Angier has a pistol ready to shoot the Prestige in case he was a monster. So it fuels Borden's narrative in the book as a case of generally not wanting to see what is in front of one's own eyes. And this simple statement is the whole genre of the book, and I think this is why it's called a mystery. That Borden says this line, and this line of not wanting to see what's in front of one's own eyes is in both the book and the film. Angier doesn't want to see his Prestiges, he gets rid of them as soon as possible. But these fantastical elements, like I'm pretty sure, I haven't studied science, but I'm pretty sure that Nikola Tesla didn't design a cloning device. So these fantastical elements like this machinery and obviously the whole electric current stuff that Angier seems to be playing with, this is what people call fantasy because it doesn't link to the real world. It's not part of what we know to be Victorian. But I myself, I like to call it sort of a neo-Victorian cyberpunk film because it has all the elements of a cyberpunk film. It has the one protagonist that rises above the rest. It has machinery that probably wasn't even invented until 100 years later. It has a grueling antagonist that is sort of at the top of the class chain. It has a vile conflict until death. It has all these elements of a cyberpunk film which seem to me to constitute it as that, but loads of people don't seem to like my opinion.
In the end, what do you think? What do you think of this movie, and why do you think people should go see the movie and read the book?
I think it's a very, very good study in design. The book and the film are both so incredibly clever that you can't possibly just watch the film once or just read the book once. You always feel like you've missed something, so you have to go back and read it again or go back and watch it again. And you're always, to this day, I am still picking out things that I haven't realised before. I think I've watched the film well over 12 times.
Yeah, I think that's what's so great about the book and the movie. I've probably watched the movie 6-7 times, and I've read the book 4 or 5 times. There's really something you can pull out of it every time. The movie illuminates the book, and the book illuminates the movie. It's a really great combination where I think a lot of times that doesn't happen.
I mean, definitely. I mean, I found that watching the film and reading Borden's narrative in the book at the same time, putting them against each other, is a very, very good way to understanding what actually happens in the film. And it's so incredibly intelligent. I mean, the way you completely miss that this is Borden's design for killing Fallon and not Borden's... I mean, Angier's not a part of this. It's between Borden and Fallon, not Borden and Angier. I mean, Borden's design for killing Fallon is so intense that you think that Borden's just trying to kill Angier. I mean, to be able to misdirect you into believing that you're trying to kill a different person is quite impressive.
Today is the first in a series of 3 episodes examining the life and impact of the great inventor Nikola Tesla. Each episode will stand alone, but they really go well together as a series, and I think you will enjoy each one individually and even more as a whole group together. I, of course, want to thank Annie of the 5'2" blog today for coming onto the show for her second time. If you haven't listened to her show that we did together on Dorian Gray, you absolutely should. It was a wonderful show. I enjoyed that one thoroughly. It is always a pleasure, of course, to talk with Annie. We definitely share a great enjoyment of the movie and book of The Prestige. I can't recommend the book and movie enough. You can learn more about Annie and her blog at 5foot2blog.com. That's the number 5, FT, the number 2, blog.com. Or, of course, you can link in the show notes. If you have ideas for shows or would like to talk about movies we've discussed, there are many ways to get in contact. You can email me at steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I really highly suggest you join the new Facebook group by searching for A2Z History Page Group. All of this and more are on my website, a2zhistorypage.com. With that, I will see you next time beyond the big screen.